Thank you, Ferris. Thank you all for being here this morning, and thank you, of course, to the organizers for putting this event together. It's been wonderful so far, and I hope not to destroy the momentum. Russell Kirk liked a good horror story, so let me start with one of my own. The other day, I was walking past the newly refurbished Barnes & Noble at my local shopping mall. They'd spent the better part of the year moving it from one location to somewhere else in the mall, and the grand opening was just a couple of weeks ago. I'd been looking forward to it, and it was beautiful. And as you would expect, great selection of books. It did not have my latest book, 13 novels conservatives will love but probably haven't read. But still, it was pretty impressive. What struck me, though, was how it lured the shoppers inside. Busy shoppers walking by saw on this enormous window display dozens of copies of books by a single author, the romantasy novelist Sarah Moss. Dozens of her books, front and center, beckoning shoppers into the world of literary commerce. Titles like The Court of Mist and Fury, A Court of Thorns and Roses, A Court of Silver Flames. Say what you will about her novels, her titles are reliably iambic. I don't know a lot about romantasy, really. But a recent Wall Street Journal article was my introduction to this popular genre that is apparently taking young female readers by storm. The journalist described it as, quote, a mix of fantasy and romance in which heroines ride dragons and battle enemies and otherwise navigate magical realms, all while living their best sex lives. Women love the genre, apparently, because it depicts sex and love in what to them are in ideal terms. But alas, the article continues, the books create such unreal expectations about what a relationship should offer that mortal men can't match up. And it quotes a therapist who reports having single clients who have had to break away from romantasy because it sets up unrealistic ideals of a relationship and how they'll be treated. Now, it's easy to laugh about this, but it's not really all that new a story. It's basically what Miguel Cervantes was satirizing in Don Quixote, and Charlotte Lennox in The Female Quixote, and Walter Scott in Waverly, and Jane Austen in Northanger Abbey. To mention just a few examples, fiction, when read carelessly or credulously or just written badly, has the power to addle the impressionable brain. And that power is also evident, I think, more sadly. But by the way, about romantasy, if young men are trying to court women, I think you need to read romantasy so you understand what women are looking for, and maybe wear fake elf ears around or something. This power is also evident in a story that the New York Times ran just the other day about efforts to encourage men to read more fiction. It began with a description of a men-only book club organized by somebody named Yadon Israel. The day after reading a book, quote, which examines contemporary masculinity, Mr. Israel had a panic attack. 2 days later, he said he was diagnosed with depression. He has spent months since grappling with painful realizations that came out of the discussion about how toxic masculinity has harmed his own marriage. That's kind of sad. It's also, I think, is it mean to say, a little bit pathetic? I don't mean to make fun of his despair, but I predict that this lead anecdote will not inspire men to read more fiction. I don't think men need to be depressed anymore about toxic masculinity. Though the anecdote does reveal, again, that fiction can inspire strong, perhaps life-changing, if not life-affirming reactions. It can force us to consider our own lives, our own behavior, our own shortcomings, to adapt what John Dryden wrote of music to this context, quote, what passion cannot fiction raise and quell? These are all examples of fiction run amok, or readers run amok, but I come to praise fiction, not bury it. So with the help of Russell Kirk, I'll turn to the case for fiction, and especially novels, why we should be reading despite all the signs that we are doing so less and less. I'll first state the obvious, which is that great fiction can be a source of beauty, wonder, and joy. I think that's obvious, but but it is worth emphasizing because it is what is most immediately appealing about fiction. That is worth praising. We should not discount the visceral thrill of encountering an evocative description of a beautiful landscape or a well-turned sentence, the kind of sentence that might force us to slow down as we go, but demands that we reread it out of pleasure because of the way it unfolds before our eyes, or just the joy of a perfectly paced set piece or scene. Great fiction can be a ballast for the kind of beauty that Roger Scruton himself always encouraged us to keep alive in the world. But great literature does much more than that. Kirk recognized great fiction as a vehicle for developing one's moral imagination. As you know, it's a term he borrowed from Edmund Burke, and he explained that the moral imagination, quote, signifies the power of ethical perception which strides beyond the barriers of private perception and momentary events. It aspires to the apprehending of right order in the soul and right order in the commonwealth. It is the moral imagination which informs us concerning the dignity of human nature, which instructs us that we are more than naked apes. Unquote. So the moral imagination has private and public implications, and Kirk believed he saw it exercised most wonderfully in the 20th century by Eliot, Frost, Faulkner, Waugh, and Yeats. So not only novelists, but certainly novelists. Fiction's defenders often celebrate its ability to expand our powers of sympathy, and I think that it indeed does do that. It's too much to say that reading fiction makes us better humans. Some people like to say things like that, as if people who don't read fiction are lesser people. Again, I don't think that's a good way to draw people into reading fiction either. But it can certainly deepen our understanding of human nature. A great novel brings us into the consciousness of its characters, exposes us to their trains of thought, the circumstances leading to their decisions, whether good or bad, in a way that other narrative forms simply cannot. Films, for example, as superior as they are in some ways, cannot get us into the interior lives of characters in the same way that fiction can. Fiction has the power to help us understand, if not necessarily agree with, unfamiliar ways of thinking as it entertains us. And sometimes this can help us develop our sympathetic abilities, and that's nothing to sneeze at. But the moral imagination, as Kirk understood it, is about more than just sympathy. It is about normative judgment. Great literature illustrates the importance of what he called standards of private and public conduct. The trick is doing that without proselytizing. As Scruton warned, works of propaganda sacrifice aesthetic integrity to political correctness, character to caricature, and drama to sermonizing. And authors who aspire to the moral imagination run the risk of proselytizing and becoming propaganda. But even apart from those concerns, some fiction, especially satire, can help with the moral imagination, not by developing sympathy, but what I'll call our antipathetic abilities, our recognition of what is wrong with other people. As Muriel Spark wrote in the 1970s, ridicule is the only honorable weapon we have left, and that is where satire can come in handy. The literary critic Lionel Trilling, a near contemporary of Kirk, called the novel the most effective agent of the moral imagination. Its greatness and its practical usefulness lay in its unremitting work of involving the reader himself in the moral life, inviting him to put his own motives under examination, suggesting that reality is not as his conventional education has led him to see it. It taught us the extent of human variety and the value of this variety. But unfortunately, as you may have noticed, our culture is disconnecting itself, severing itself from this wonderful source of beauty and the moral imagination. According to the National Endowment for the Arts, in a study they conducted in 1982, back then, 57% of American adults reported having read literature, novels and poetry, in the preceding year. 2 decades later, 2002, that number had dropped to 46.7%, so a 10% drop. It has not gotten better. You won't be surprised to hear. The most recent study from just a couple of years ago had that level at 37.6%. So we're looking at, I'm not a mathematician, but that's a 20% drop over 40 years. And it's no secret why. There is a lot of competition for our attention. In the early 80s, you had 3 channels and terrestrial radio and maybe a Betamax. There are a lot more other forms of entertainment available to us, so it's not surprising that we're not reading as much. Young people especially are reading less, and men are reading much less fiction than women. What's really alarming is that young people used to be the most likely to read fiction for fun, and now they are among the least likely to do so. The advent of artificial intelligence could make reading even less relevant and less common. AI threatens to make attentive reading less and less desirable, easier to avoid. As people read less, they will be less capable of distinguishing good writing from bad, or even, perhaps, I fear, human creativity from its artificial counterpart. In other words, if you think things are bad now, you ain't seen nothing yet. If you don't read much, you don't recognize bad grammar either. But as we've been discussing, a healthy conservatism must offer hope, so let me try. As a number of previous panelists have already mentioned, conservatism does not mean mindless repetition of the past, but renewing tradition for new contexts and times. This panel is about renewal, after all, not reversion or regression. And in this context, maybe it's possible to use technology to keep fiction relevant. I think that's what Ross Douthat, among other writers, have tried to do through Substack. Ross released in serial form a fantasy novel on Substack last fall, and I just wrapped it up a couple of weeks ago. So Substack and perhaps other social media and internet forms are ways for us to distribute fiction in new ways. We have publishers like Wiseblood publishing literary fiction that does more than just cater to literary fashions. We have great people like James Matthew Wilson, and I'm not naming him because he's not here, so I'll get nothing out of it, and his creative writing program nurturing new generations of young and hopefully great artists. Also, we shouldn't forget that the internet has made centuries of literary greatness much more accessible than ever before. It's much easier and safer to read an enormous Victorian novel riding the subway with a Kindle than with the Penguin Classics edition that could be mistaken for a weapon. I want to find inspiration, or at least instruction, from a great conservative writer we don't talk enough about, but whom Russell Kirk loved and called his literary mentor. And I'm talking about the Scottish novelist Walter Scott. In the introductory narrative to The Fair Maid of Perth, published in 1828, Scott gives us a fictional editor named Crystal Croftangry, who recalls an event that occurred when he was visiting Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh. A friend of his was a housekeeper of Queen Mary's old rooms in the palace, and she was showing a visitor the room in which Mary's advisor, David Rizzio, had been murdered more than 200 years before, and his bloodstains still marked the floor. And this visitor was very bored by the tour until she showed him the bloodstains, because this visitor, he was coming up from London, and he was a salesman. And it just so happened that one of the products he was trying to sell was a stain removal. So the housekeeper shows him the stains, and she says, they've been here for 250 years and nothing will remove him. And he sees them and says, gets on his hands and knees and says, 250 years, ma'am, and nothing taken away? Why, if it had been 500, I have something in my pocket. We'll fetch it out in 5 minutes. Do you see this elixir, ma'am? I will show you the stain vanish in a moment. And so he gets down and starts scrubbing, and she screams, and that gets the attention of Crystal Croftangry, the narrator, and he runs to the spot, and he finds what he calls the well-meaning traveler scrubbing the floor, and they pull him away. And Croftangry explains to him that there are such things in the world as stains, which ought to remain indelible on account of the associations with which they are connected. Later, another character praises Croft Angry for this intervention, calling him a hero who has, contrary to Burke's claims and reflections, quote, shown the world that the age of chivalry still exists. In the conservative mind, Kirk praised Scott for popularizing the proud and subtle doctrines of Burke, and you can see why in this passage. In the case of this entertaining and enlightening scene, Scott gives us a parable for how history and tradition can be lost to ignorance, technology, to commerce, in a way that only great fiction can show us. I admit that's an imperfect analogy for the state of the novel or literature more generally, especially because literature is greater and more dynamic than just a bloodstain that kind of just sits in the floor. But I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see that for those of us who recognize the value of the novel in developing the moral imagination, we have a role in defending the form from the incursions of what threatens it. Not salesmen from London necessarily, but from other forms of media, from lazy teachers, from other forms of, and from really worthless fiction. And to explain to our friends, our students, our children, and their teachers that the novel has endured for centuries because it is capable of shaping the moral imagination in a way that no other form can. I want to close with another optimistic note. Return to the outside of a bookstore again, this time with a positive spin and with the help of Russell Kirk, who wrote in 1981, quote, in the franchise bookshops of the year of our Lord 1981, the shelves are crowded with the prickly pears and the Dead Sea fruit of literary decadence. Yet no civilization rests forever content with literary boredom and literary violence. Or I would add romanticy. Once again, a conscience may speak to a conscience in the pages of books, and the parched rising generation may grope their way toward the springs of moral imagination. Let us hope that there is still a thirst for this beauty in the moral imagination, and that we can seek to slake it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher.